So now we're going to take a little time to lay in our background and start adding some tones and shadows. To do a background, it's a lot simpler than you would think, and it's one of my favorite tools. We're going to use the gradient tool. So you can hit G for gradient, and it will automatically pull up your gradient tool. If you don't see your gradient tool, it might be hiding underneath the paint bucket, depending on what version of Photoshop you're working in. Or you can also go to the three dots and hold that down, and your gradient tool will be hiding underneath here. All right, so I'm going to create a new layer to put my gradient into. So I'll use the plus sign at the bottom of my palette, but remember you can use Control-Shift-N, or you can go to Layer, New Layer. And I do not like this gradient. This gradient is not going to be what I want to do. So getting into the gradient editor is a good thing to learn how to do. So we're going to go to this little drop down right next to our gradient. I mean, there's no difference between the two tones. It's basically just a straight color. And I'm going to look at some of my options. And I don't really like any of those options. So I'm going to create my own gradient by double clicking right here in the middle of where the gradient is. So I'll double click and that'll pull up our gradient editor. Now, depending on the version of Photoshop you're running, it may look a little different. You may just have these presets, or the newer versions have all of these preset lovely gradients built in. So I can spin open my blues and I can see there's some really neat blues in there. However, the blues don't really match the tone that I have. So I'm going to create my own gradient from scratch. I know that I want to kind of pull out a little bit of this tone for this side, and I know that my light source is going to be up here in the corner. So I'm going to go to this side of my gradient first. I'm going to click on it and I'm going to change this color to a very, very faint blue. I don't want it to be straight white. I want it to have just a little hint of color in it. And then this color at the other end, I'm going to click on the bottom and I'm going to pull from this blue by clicking on it first and then just tweaking it just a little bit, and we'll see how that looks. If we don't like it, we can always recreate our gradient. I'm going to click OK, and now I have a new custom gradient. So when I hit OK, it will pop up here in this spot. Now there are several different types of gradients we can do. We can do a linear gradient, which is from side to side, but that doesn't look good. So we're going to hit Control Z, get rid of that. In fact, let's move this back over here so you can see my keystrokes. I like this radial gradient option, and what that does is it starts from the middle and then radiates out. Oops. I don't like that one. I went a little too far here. There we go. So I can see the color is concentrated at the beginning and then goes out to the end, but it's backwards. That's not the way I want it to be. So I'm going to click on this gradient editor again, and I'm just going to switch these two positions. I'm just going to drag this one over here, and I'm going to drag this one back over here. There we go, and hit OK. And then I'm going to pull this out again, click, hold, and drag. And I kind of like that. If I click, hold, and drag longer, then it will fade that color out further. Not quite liking that. I think this blue is just a little bit too dark. So I'm going to go in one more time, and I'm going to adjust this blue by clicking on it and bringing it up to a lighter color. We'll try that one more time. I'm going to click, hold, and drag. I want the light to be right here behind the corner. Ah, that's much better. I think I like that. Let's just turn it this way just a little bit. And one more time. Yeah, I like the way that looks. We have a nice solid light source over here, and it's kind of throwing a shadow on this direction. So that's a good starting point. So let's pause here to take a look over at our layers. I have my layers are coming in 1, 2, layer 0. That's great, but as we start to create more and more layers, they're harder to find. So I'm going to double click on this, and I'm just going to name it background. Getting into the habit of naming your layers early is a really good habit. So we'll call this one base layer. our base shape. All right, so this layer, we don't even need this one anymore. We can leave it there if we want to, but it's just gonna get in the way. So I'm gonna go down to the bottom of the layers palette and I'm just gonna hit the trash button. It's gonna ask me, are you sure? And I'm gonna tell it yes. Okay, so now that we have our base shape on top of our background, we need to talk about some shadows. And one of the first things that many people like to do in Photoshop is to create a layer style. So if we just go down here to the effects, or actually let's just come up here so we can see image, layer, layer style. Everybody likes to go straight to this drop shadow, but here's the problem. We're not getting very realistic shadows off of this layer style. It's the shadow is dropping all the way around it, and of course we could probably tweak these settings a little bit, but it's not a very realistic shadow. So what I'm going to do is use my pen tool again, and then I'm going to use that gradient tool that I just used to create a more realistic shadow. So let's go and create a new layer to put our shadow on. So come down here, hit the new button. I'm going to go ahead and get into the habit of naming it as soon as I create it, shadow. And I'm going to come over here to my paths, and I'm going to create a new path as well, because who knows, we may end up having to use this shadow over and over again. Now, if I come back over here, I can see in my base shape, I have something called effects. That's because I used my effects and I don't want that. So I'm just going to click on it, on the effects part, right click, and we're going to clear that layer style, because that is not a very good shadow. All right, so return to our shadow layer. Make sure we have a new path. And I'm going to grab that P for pen. Now, if our light source is coming from this direction, we have to think a little bit about perspective. So I'm going to start here in the corner, and I think that my shadow would maybe fade out a little bit this way. It's not going to be a very long shadow. So, but I'm going to go ahead and keep pulling this out anyway, just to be safe here. I'm going to come right, and it's okay. Look, you can take your path outside of your image. That's all right. And I think that if the light is coming this direction, if I'm following perspective, it's probably going to come around this way. Now, here's a interesting dilemma. What do I do with my path? Do I have to follow here to get a perfect selection? No, you can actually come right behind here. We're just going to do it like this. And I'll show you why this is easier in a minute. So I look at my path. Looks pretty good. I'm going to double click on it and put shadow. All right, and oh, where did it go? It's because I clicked off of my path. If I click on it again, it will pop right back up. I'm going to hold down that G for gradient tool, and this time we're going to do a different kind of gradient. So we're going to come back up into our gradient editor by clicking right in the middle. And if you notice, this one has color to, and it fades to transparency. We're going to do that one instead. And I want my shadow to be, shadows are never truly just black. They always have a little bit of tone of color in them. So I'm going to just go right above the black to this deep blue here and hit OK. Now I have a nice blue toned shadow. I'm going to tell it OK. And it's, if you see, it's cool. It goes from a opaque color and fades into a transparency, just like a real shadow. So I'll hit OK. And now that I have my gradient tool, I'm just going to play with this a little bit. We're going to pull it out, see how that looks. Oh, look at that. We're on a radial gradient. So I'm going to Control Z to undo that. And we're going to switch this over to a linear gradient because we want the gradient to consistently move across this direction. So we'll click, hold, and drag. Oh, what happened? Guess what I forgot to do? I created the path, but I did not turn it into a selection. So I'm going to click on my path and click on my selection, and now my gradient will be contained inside those magic ants. Look at that. That's not too bad. I'm going to hit Control D to kill those ants, but the problem is it's in front of my shape. So let's grab that shadow over here in our layers palette, click, hold, and drag it down in between. Now we've got a nice color here. This side over here I'm not too crazy about. So if I click my shadow again and turn it into a selection again, I can delete that shadow and I can do it again until I like it. So I'm just gonna play around with this gradient tool for a second. That's not too bad. Let's see, we'll kill those ants by hitting Control D. Much better. And because shadows are never really quite that sharp, we're going to use a filter to kind of soften up those edges a little bit. That filter is called Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. The Gaussian Blur is a very helpful tool. So when we pull it up here, we can see that we have a preview button, and we can see that our shadow just kind of disappeared, and that's because we have a very, very large radius. So I'm going to bring this back down, and I can kind of see my shadow taking shape here. There we go. Just kind of roll it around until you get it where you like it. And that's not too bad.